So now we've got to the point in the course where we can begin to understand higher cognitive processes in terms of anatomy, physiology and chemistry. In the following sections, we're going to go through a range of cognitive processes and develop the hierarchies of description we need. But let's start with what happens when we pay attention to something. Suppose you went into a room and the room looked like this. You look around, probably focus your attention briefly on a number of objects, and perhaps take some actions. We know that certain brain regions play a bigger role than others in determining which objects you'll pay attention to. And we want to be able to understand how the processes in those regions support the attention behaviors. We want to understand how the activity of cortical columns acting through subcortical structures support the attention processes. In other words, we're looking for a multi-level description capability covering all these levels. We want to go deeper to understand the neuron processes involved, the synaptic processes, and even down to the neurochemical processes like ion channel opening that support attention at the most detailed level. So what I want to establish next is a multi-level description of attention with the ability to map any small part of a more approximate higher level description to a more precise detailed description, and of course vice versa, to fit the detailed description into a higher level description. At each point, we will pick critical pieces of the higher level description and map them down to the next more detailed level. So once again, remember that our minds couldn't follow a description at a more detailed level. But because of the information paradigms, we have a reliable map to move between levels. So we're looking for a multi-level description of attention so that we can map small parts of an approximate high-level description to more precise detailed descriptions. So, going back to this room, at the highest level, when you go into the room, in the first instance, you just process information from the visual scene as a whole, without picking on any particular object. But almost immediately, you start to move your head and eyes. You look around the room, stopping and centering your head and eyes on different objects. And in some cases, you pause a bit longer on one object, which means you can then develop a number of behavioral recommendations with respect to just that object. Your current behavioral priorities influence where your eyes settle. If you're hungry, they tend to settle on possible food objects, like chocolate. Your current plans influence what you look at. If in the course of a task you need a pair of scissors, for example, you tend to settle on possible targets like this. So attention means that your brain is selecting an object in the environment, then processing a lot of visual information derived from just that one object in order to develop a range of behavioral recommendations with respect to that object. So, in information process terms, conditions detected in the sensory information derived from the overall visual scene recommend paying attention to each of the different visual objects in turn. And the strongest recommendation results in information derived from just that one object being processed in more detail to detect conditions that have a range of recommendations with respect to that object. But this process can be interrupted by a higher priority. If you hear a scream, conditions detected in the auditory inputs have very strong recommendation strengths in favor of shifting visual attention to look where it came from. So these are the major behavioral features of the attention process at high level. Looking at a scene and deciding where to point your gaze. Looking from object to object, and with some objects, processing a lot more information to decide what, if anything, to do about them, and interrupting the process if necessary. And the one I haven't mentioned so far, combining information from multiple objects. For example, if a behavioral priority is to relax for a few minutes, attention focused in turn on the chair, the remote, and the television leads to detection of combination conditions within the group as a whole. These combination conditions recommend, among other things, sitting down and turning on the television. So you have to be able to combine the conditions detected within several different objects and detect more complex conditions that can recommend appropriate behaviors with respect to the group as a whole. So let's have a look at this in slightly more detail. When you enter a room, or look at this picture of a room, your eyes flick around, pausing at different points. In slow motion, it might look like this. During these flicks, that are called saccades, your eyes move with perhaps the fastest muscle movements made by any part of the body. The pauses, indicated by the circles, last between 100 and perhaps 400 milliseconds. If you focus attention on something, the pause is at the long end of that range. During the pauses, an image of an object is focused on the most sensitive part of the retina, called the fovea. The shorter pauses get enough information to generate conditions that can recommend a longer pause, and the information collected during a longer pause can be enough to generate conditions that are able to recommend behaviors in response to the object. At a more detailed level, at the level of brain anatomy, quite a lot of brain regions are contributing to these processes, including several cortical areas and a number of subcortical structures. The frontal eye fields, or FEF cortical area, is heavily involved in driving saccades and also any head movements that are needed. There's a structure called the superior colliculus that's the output of the brain to the eye muscles. Then you've got the apparatus of the basal ganglia and the thalamus that operate, in this case, between the frontal eye fields and the superior colliculus. There's an area called the supplementary eye fields, and this SEF is heavily interconnected with the frontal eye fields. The SEF seem to play a role in detecting any errors in saccades. For example, if your eye isn't centered exactly on the visual image of an object, if the image is a bit offset from the fovea, the SEF detects conditions that correlate with a visual mismatch, and these conditions recommend generation of small corrective eye movements. Two more cortical areas are also heavily involved. The lateral intraparietal cortex, or LIP, is involved in determining which objects in the visual environment will be looked at first. In other words, the relative priority of different objects currently in the visual field. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPC, is also involved in a similar kind of prioritization. The difference between these areas is that the LIP seems to reflect more tactical or short-term priorities, while the DLPC determines more strategic priorities. So these areas are influencing the objects on which your gaze will settle, on the basis of different behavioral priorities. The visual areas, fairly close to sensory input, are also involved, and the cerebellum is participating, especially perhaps in directing any head movements needed. So, what are the information processes being performed by all these structures in support of attention? If we have a closer look at the relevant connectivity just within the cortex, there's strong reciprocal connectivity between all these cortical areas. Then they all project directly to the superior colliculus, and the thalamus and even the basal ganglia also project directly to the superior colliculus. And the superior colliculus, as I mentioned, controls the eye muscles via the brainstem. But in fact, both the frontal eye fields and the cerebellum also influence eye muscles via direct projections to the brainstem. If you look in even more detail at the cortex basal ganglia thalamus loop on the right, which is the one concerned with eye movements, a limited region of the striatum gets lots of inputs from the frontal eye fields, and it also gets a lot from input from the LIP and the DLPC. These inputs are processed through a small region of the GPI-SNR and then a specific part of the thalamus, but the thalamus targets mostly the frontal eye fields. So what's going on? Well, the frontal eye fields are getting a massive amount of input from the visual cortex derived from all across the current visual field. The FEF detects lots of receptive fields, each with recommendation strengths into the basal ganglia in favour of a range of eye and head movements that would centre the fovea on different points in the visual field, in other words, different objects. There are neurons in the striatum corresponding with each of the different possible eye movements, and an FEF receptive field targets the appropriate range of these striatal neurons. The LIP is detecting receptive fields that discriminate between different types of shapes in the visual field. Remember, we talked about cortical area TE that also discriminates between different types of visual objects, with the difference that the LIP gets a lot of input directly from the early visual processing areas rather than via a number of intermediate areas, which is the case for area TE. So the LIP can detect receptive fields discriminating between shapes a bit faster than TE, although with less detailed discrimination capability. So detection of an LIP receptive field can be interpreted as a recommendation in favour of eye movements towards the next kind of shape that should get attention. In other words, given all the shapes in the visual field and which shapes have got attention so far, which types of shapes should get attention next. The DLPC detects receptive fields that discriminate between very complex circumstances in which different general types of behaviour are appropriate. And these fields recommend directing attention towards the type of shape most likely to be needed given current general behavioural priorities. If you're in the process of opening a sealed package, receptive fields detected in this area will recommend looking first at certain types of objects that can cut, for example. In this region of the striatum, different neurons correspond with different eye movements. So these neurons get inputs from the FEF, the LIP, and the DPLC, and interpret these inputs as recommendations in favour of their corresponding eye movement. Competition within the basal ganglia determines the most strongly recommended movement, which is then implemented through the thalamus by release of the subset of FEF outputs that recommended it, and these outputs go to the superior colliculus to drive eye movements. But note that at this level of description, there are some approximations. For example, the supplementary eye fields, the SEF, also get some projections back from the thalamus and release information directly to the superior colliculus. Now at this point, let me say a bit more about this simplified conceptual picture of the cortex as a whole. I'll be using this kind of picture with a few variations to discuss all sorts of different cognitive phenomena. In the picture, there are different cortical areas, and each area is an array of columns. And all the columns in one array detect receptive fields in the same range of complexity. There are several areas detecting receptive fields within information derived only from visual inputs, and the receptive field complexity increases as you go through the different areas, and the receptive fields are therefore able to discriminate between different types of purely visual circumstances, different types of visual features, visual objects, and so on. Then there's receptive fields detected within only auditory information, able to discriminate, for example, between different speech sounds or between different spoken words. Areas that only process information derived from one sense, like auditory or visual, are sometimes called monomodal. Then, in the parietal cortex, there are areas detecting more complex receptor fields that may in some cases be polymodal, fields that include information derived from several different senses. However, as we mentioned, the LIP area in the parietal cortex gets input from relatively early visual processing areas, so it can make relatively simple discriminations between different types of visual objects and do it a bit faster than area TE. Then there's prefrontal areas that detect very complex receptive fields able to discriminate between a range of circumstances. Then there are the cortical areas associated with the hippocampus, detecting receptive fields correlating with groups of cortical fields in other areas that expanded at the same time in the past. And these areas are heavily interconnected with the hippocampus proper, which has even more complex receptive fields of the same general type. Then finally, there's the cortex-like part of the amygdala, detecting receptive fields correlating with general circumstances, with perhaps a higher degree of genetic control over receptive field definitions than in the rest of the cortex. So, looking at the attention process in these terms, the LIP detects receptive fields discriminating between different types of shape. And as I mentioned, one way of verbalizing the type of attention recommendations possessed by these fields is, if this type of shape is present in the visual field, look for some other type of specific shape, such as, if there's a television type shape, shift eye gaze towards any shapes similar to a remote. And the dorsolateral prefrontal cortices detect very complex receptor fields that could have attention-related recommendation strength like, if a particular emotion or social situation is present, favor shifting eye gaze towards certain types of shapes. Here, an example might be a receptive field detecting a hot, sunny situation and recommending shifting eye gaze towards any tree-like shapes. And the value of a recommendation like that would be that shade could be available under the tree. Although the FEF provides the bulk of the outputs to the superior colliculus, all the relevant cortical areas also project. So all these receptive fields can have valuable recommendation strengths in favor of eye movements. And interestingly, even the basal ganglia also project directly to the superior colliculus. This direct connectivity of the basal ganglia, bypassing the thalamus even, is likely needed to allow extremely fast release of superior colliculus outputs to drive eye muscles. Now, the basal ganglia outputs are inhibitory, but they target both the superior colliculus neurons that drive eye movements and inhibitory interneurons that inhibit those superior colliculus neurons. So, depending on the circumstances, the basal ganglia can either inhibit or excite eye movements relatively directly. Finally, there may be sequences of head and eye movements that are often utilized in support of attention behaviors. For example, when scanning a face, there may be frequently used small sequences of movements, pausing at eyes, nose, mouth, ears, and so on, in similar relative positions for most faces. And once again, the muscle sequences to make these movements have been learned by the cortex and the basal ganglia, but then after that they can be acquired and rapidly executed when needed by the cerebellum. So this is the connectivity, plus the internal basal ganglia circuitry that I've also put in. Receptive field detections in various cortical areas recommend different eye movements, and the competition via the direct and the indirect paths in the basal ganglia selects the most appropriate. Often, the thalamus implements the selected behavior, mainly by releasing appropriate cortical outputs to the superior colliculus. But the thalamus can sometimes be bypassed, with the GPI-SNR acting directly on the superior colliculus to achieve greater speed. So that's given a high-level view of the attention process, and in the next section we'll get into processing one visual object in detail and the steps in that process.